Okay, our next presenter this morning is Drahos. Alexander lives in Cedar Rapids and attends Linn-Mar High School. He's the son of Amy and Matthew Drahos. The title of his project is Access Iowa.
Awesome, thank you. And thank you all for being here today. I know there are many things you could be doing with your Saturday, so I appreciate it. But my name is Alex Drahos, and for the past year and a half, I have been working to make broadband accessible in the state of Iowa through my project, Access Iowa. Now, this is some of what I'm going to be talking about today, but I'm going to talk about what broadband is, in case you don't know, the state of Iowa broadband, the impact of the lack of broadband, my advocacy journey, my broadband wins, the shift I took when COVID-19 hit, my recent work, and then my next steps going forward. So, what is broadband? Broadband is a high-capacity transmission technique that allows internet and communication services. It's what's allowing this computer right now to run. It's what's allowing the Facebook Live to go on. That is what broadband does. And so nationally, over 90% of the population has what's called fixed access, which means that they can essentially connect at a wireless connection at a speed of 25 megabytes per second download speed, which is very important, and this is deemed as adequate. Currently, Iowa is 38th in the nation for broadband, and a recent Microsoft survey found that 70% of Iowa is underserved when it comes to broadband, which is quite a big issue. And another survey found that 52.4% of Iowa did not have that gold standard of fixed access. Some more statistics for you. 480,000 Iowans don't have fixed access broadband. 145,000 Iowans do not have any wired providers where they live, which means they can't have broadband, they can't have internet. And then 520,000 Iowans have access to only one wired provider. And having access to only one wired provider means you're stuck on those rates and you're stuck with that provider's product, which means there's no option to switch and no option for competition or better production. So what does this mean? What are the impacts of the lack of broadband? Why is broadband so important? Number one, education. Over 70% of teachers assign homework that requires the internet. Now, keep in mind that all of these statistics are pre-COVID numbers, which means they're probably much higher now. 65% of students use the internet to complete their schoolwork or homework. 2/3 of students use a class, go on online class, use online programs. And again, with COVID, that is likely much higher, especially in the state of Iowa. Now, it's also important to recognize that the internet offers a personalized knowledge experience, as well as a vastly infinite library of information. And so it's crucial that communities have that in today's day and age, especially for children and kids my age. Now, broadband also creates equity in places that are underserved because it can provide them with resources that they might not otherwise have access to. Now, what about the economy? Broadband supports over 10 million jobs in America alone. Now, an interesting statistic is that the U.S. Federal Reserve found that labor participation among married women increased by 4.1% when they had high-speed internet. For a 1% increase in broadband productivity, or also known as broadband productivity, it increased by 0.13% according to the International Telecommunications Union. And then a 10% increase in broadband penetration results in a 1.3 increase in GDP. And then agriculture, right? A backbone of the Iowa economy, but also lifestyle. Broadband means that they can use new technology. It means better yield mapping, guidance systems, soil mapping, more efficient machinery, and then ultimately a better use of water and pesticides because they can collect data and distribute it properly. So with all this information, I began my journey. And I actually found out about broadband because I was watching a documentary and there was a map, and on the map, dark red was the worst states with broadband and gray was the best. And Iowa was right in the middle, a medium red. And I said, well, we can do better than that. So I started researching. And I looked at all those statistics that I just went through. I looked at the state of Iowa's broadband. And I came up with the conclusion that something had to be done. And so I decided to do it through legislative advocacy. And currently there is a grant program called the Empower Rural Iowa Broadband Grant Program that the state of Iowa funds that creates broadband infrastructure all over Iowa, especially in underserved areas. And so I decided to pursue that and advocate for allocating $5 million to that project. And so what I did is, come October, after researching, after figuring out my path, I partnered with the State of Iowa Youth Advisory Council, which is a powerful group that is under the Department of Human Rights, and I issued this statement with them, essentially asking to allocate more funding to that grant program. And so after doing this, I met with legislators. You can see some of the ones I look up there if you recognize any names. From a bipartisan background, I contacted the Legislative Services Agency to see the feasibility of doing this and the policy impacts. I also contacted committee members, especially those working with appropriations, to see the possibility of doing this and to advocate for increasing funding. And then I also contacted the executive officials like Governor Kim Reynolds, asking her to increase funding and advocating for that. And then a few months later, after I was doing this, from about October to February, I was advocating pretty often. There was a $5 million increase to the Empower Rural Iowa Broadband Grant Program, exactly what I was advocating for. Now, about 2 months after this, somewhat related, Senate File 2400, broadband infrastructure tax exemptions were increased, and then also the maximum amount of grants possible, but the grant number was also increased, which was fantastic. And so here's the timeline just of sort of what I did. You can see kind of my work and how it shifted throughout the year up until about March. And I wanted to touch on this too, because by no means am I saying that I was the only stakeholder in this and the only person advocating for broadband. But when you look at counties and towns, of course, counties and towns and those leaders are going to want broadband. Telecom companies, if incentivized correctly, are going to want an increase in broadband. And business owners, of course, that's going to boost their business. But what you don't see is typically 18 to 24-year-olds advocating for broadband. And that's why it was so critical that I advocated for this project, because I was sort of the last piece in the puzzle. Because most other students in my demographic were not advocating for it. And so when I was meeting with legislators, it opened up an entire new door of people who wanted broadband, and it also put a lot more pressure on them to enact change. And that's why it was so crucial for me to advocate for broadband. Now, COVID-19 caused my project to shift a little bit, and also after I got the $5 million, I was like, okay, great. But I wasn't done yet. So I went from legislative advocacy to kind of another sector advocacy, sort of private sector, but also with nonprofits. So telecommunication companies, businesses, corporations, nonprofits. I tried to connect with them all, seeing how I could create the most change possible. And so this kind of led me to my recent work. Number one, I met with my Hoover mentor, Kimber Lockhart, who actually had some great connections here in the state of Iowa and some great ideas regarding this shift with changes. And so she introduced me to Link Kroger. And Link Kroger is a former telecommunication veteran. He is a tech and education nonprofit founder, and he actually, I believe, served on the Empower Rural Iowa Broadband Grant Program. So he's very experienced with this, and I got to connect with him, and he ran me through the current state of broadband, new technology, and other ways I could connect in this field. So number three, I reached out to Google Fiber, and Google Fiber essentially is building broadband around the country. It's a great program. They fund it completely based on their corporation. So I reached out to them to see if that's something we can spur here in Iowa. And so I'm currently talking with them and contacting them and seeing how I can help them and how they can help me, and ultimately the state of Iowa. So that is something that is very, very, very early in the works, so we'll see how it plays out. But that's something that is currently happening. And then now I'm trying to continue to build off those opportunities in the private sector, but also with nonprofits and things like that. So my next steps, what's going to happen after this? Number one is research, which is a critical component, especially when technology is continuing to develop. So you can see here, there is a new product. Essentially, it is broadband, right? So that infrastructure to make things, the internet run. It's half the price, which is huge, and half the time. So it's really, really fast. It's really fast to put together, but it's also fast for those consumers. Reaching out, growing connections again with Google Fiber. I'm hoping that can really take off. Telecommunication experts and more, and then ultimately I'm hoping to get in contact with some nonprofits and work for them in the broadband space, as they often help resolve inequities regarding that. And I just want to take some time on our presentation to thank people. I think that's really important, as I've spent a lot of time working with various parties. So again, Kimber Lockhart, Hoover mentor, that was a great help, so thank you, Kimber. A big thanks to Link Kroger for sitting down with me, even though he had never met me and I was from a completely different part of the state. So I really do appreciate that. And then again, all of you being here and all of the Herbert Hoover and Common students, coordinators who helped organize this event. And so, in this day and age, internet is the 21st century's goal. It is important and vital that every single person has access to the internet, and that's what Access Iowa does. That is what my project has done, is to ensure that everybody has the same economy, the same healthcare, the same agriculture, the same access to education, all of those things, so that we can all progress as Iowans, but ultimately as Americans. Thank you. Any questions?
Rick,
Go ahead.
Yeah.
what are the statistics for our neighboring states, like Minnesota, Nebraska, Missouri, and then Illinois?
Yeah, great question. In terms of broadband statistics, off the top of my head, I'd have to look it up. But I do know when it
But
comes
you know that we're 38, so
Right, yes. I know that we're 38th because I looked at specific Iowa, but
do you know that Minnesota is 48?
I don't. But I do know that Illinois actually increased their funding to, I believe it was over $100 million for broadband projects. So there is a lot of push around neighboring states. I also know Tennessee increased their funding, North Carolina increased their funding. I believe, I want to say also Kentucky increased their funding as well. So there's a big push right now. And actually, the U.S. Department of Agriculture just gave $20 million to Iowa to increase broadband. So it is a really big thing. I don't unfortunately have the specific stats on where other states lie in terms of their position in the country with broadband, but I do know that there is a big, there's a lot of momentum behind it currently. Thank you for the question. Go ahead.
Yeah. I have two questions. One deals with contacting the state government. Did you do anything in contacting any of our senators or representatives from Iowa and what's happening at the federal level with respect to the rural Iowa?
Great question. I did not contact any federal government officials. I was trying to keep it kind of within the state. I thought that would be the best route and the quickest route, just because I know it can sometimes be a little easier to work within the state government. But I think going forward, if that would definitely be a great idea if I continue with legislative advocacy. And
Then my second question is, you've been talking about the rural. Is there anything that is coming up with respect to improvement in the cities and what's happening locally? You talked about the Google and some things like that. So,
great question. I mean, number one, I hope things are happening with cities. I hope it's improving. Off the top of my head, I don't think so. I think there's a big focus on rural areas currently because they have no internet connection in especially western Iowa. However, I think with new technology, like the one I mentioned, the LTE, CBRS, half the price and half the time, that's a really portable device. It's really small. It's rather cheap, $500 compared to the usual thousands it takes for broadband. And so that would likely help aid cities as we progress because it's faster. So hopefully that will really, technological innovations like that will improve the city's broadband because I think broadband can be improved everywhere. I think we all have had internet connection issues at points in time. So I think that would be nice. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. As you know, the Empower Rural Iowa legislative package passed unanimously in the legislature.
Yes.
So great political support. So I wonder how much additional money you think you might be able to, or people might be able to get out of the legislature for this. And I also wondered what you learned about the legislative process as you lobbied for this.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Great question. I think funding will continue to be increased because actually Governor Reynolds advocated for $15 million to be increased to that program, and it was only about $5 million. But I think we're going to continue to see a rise in that. Now, with the USDA also adding $20 million into the Iowa, giving Iowa $20 million for broadband, it'll be interesting to see how much more the government asks for since we do have kind of that grant there. But I think it's definitely possible to go up. I would expect it to stay at least a consistent rate for a few more years, so I hope that it at least stays at $5 million because I do think it is kind of an issue. In terms of learning things from the legislature, a lot. I think the biggest one was communication, right? These are legislators who have a lot of things to do in their day. So you kind of have to, it's almost a persuasive speech. You have to kind of sell your pitch in a little elevator pitch, try to get them to support you. And then you also have to know your stuff, which is what I learned in the legislative process, because they will ask you questions. They will ask you, what this means for their constituents, but also the feasibility of it passing and things like that. So I think that was my biggest thing that I learned that I didn't know previously, was just that I really did have to do my research and know what I was talking about before meeting with the legislator, because they were really going to kind of grill me on it. Yeah.
U.S. News and World Report made us one of the best places to live a few years ago. And I think one of the things that they looked at was broadband. Now that leads me to think that other states must not be as good as we are if we were rated higher than that.
Well, yeah, and I with U.S. News and World Report, I think they take a lot of things. It also depends how they looked at broadband, I think, in terms of were they looking at fixed access, wired providers, or just broadband in total, how many people had broadband. There's a decent amount of people who don't have broadband in the state, but an even bigger problem is people have broadband, but it's really bad. So it's essentially almost the same because it's so slow. So that could have contributed to it. I haven't, I guess, looked at it completely, but hopefully that helps answer
Yeah,
that.
I just wanted to.
Awesome, thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Have you done any opinion pieces or reached out to public knowledge about this lack of broadband in Iowa?
Yeah, so I actually, with the State of Iowa Youth Advisory Council, I actually released a press release with them. So I did that, and then I was looking to actually release some op-eds just to local newspapers around the state, trying to, again, get that power to the people, put some pressure on legislators. And then they allocated $5 million to it, and I said, all right, great. So it was on the table, but I did have a press release that I drafted up with the State of Iowa Youth Advisory Council, but that was the main form of, I guess, public output. Thank you for the question.
Just to follow up on that, just because USDA sends, was it 15 million more?
I believe it was, yes, it would have been 20 million in total, so 15 million more.
Well, as we've learned recently, $21 million was used from the federal government for something it wasn't intended to use at all. So let's keep an eye on how those federal funds are actually being used and perhaps misused
Yep.
at the state level.
Absolutely, and hopefully the USDA has some restrictions on what they can do, and maybe hopefully the state auditor can keep tabs on it as well, because all of that money should be going towards broadband.
Correct.
And those infrastructure projects. I completely agree.
Great. Well, Alexander, thank you.
Awesome, thank you all.
So it's my pleasure and honor to present